Nick, what is your official title?
I am Senior Vice President of Special Collections based in the New York office.
10 seconds. Look at me, never look at the camera. Nick, we're live. Are you excited?
I am excited.
Well, I'm very excited to share a space with you. You and I have actually not really been in the same room in the last year and a half that I've been here, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
It's my pleasure entirely, Robert, and I feel as if I know you very well, although, as you say, we know each other virtually.
We do. So thanks to everybody who's joined us for today's discussion about the state of the market, Lalique and Art Glass. I am joined, of course, by Nick Dawes, Senior Vice President of Special Collections. The man is in New York most of the time. We're very honored to have you at the Dallas headquarters today. One of my favorite auctioneers, one of my favorite people. It is always a delight just to hear you talk. I'm glad that I have you hostage for the next hour to discuss the state of the market when it comes to Lalique and Art Glass. And I have a million questions for you. First of all, I want to ask you about these glasses we're drinking out of, because we had asked for a drink of water and you said we could only drink out of these particular glasses. I have never before had a sip of water out of a glass worth $1,000. What, sir, is sitting in front of me, and why should I touch this?
Well, and thank you for your compliment on auctioneering. When I auctioneer, which I do in Dallas mostly, but sometimes in New York, I insist on drinking water from a Lalique glass. To me, it's the plastic water bottle is but if you're going to use a glass, why not use a Lalique glass if you're selling Lalique especially? These particular glasses were sitting here in Dallas, ready to be auctioned on October 28th. And I thought, we could use some water, let's use these. They happen to be, by the way, they're not $1,000 glasses.
Oh, okay.
They're more like $1,800 glasses. They happen to be the rarest of all Lalique stemware. Lalique, which we'll talk about today, much of the glass that we sell was made between the two world wars. These were made in the 1930s. And by that time, René Lalique and his company were making a lot of glass and a lot of table glass. It was a big part of his empire. But these, for some reason, which are particularly hard to make, were made in tiny quantities. And we know that because we just never seen them.
And people are, by the way, now seeing very close-up shots of the glass. I know you can't see this, the shot. I can, because I can see my computer, so people can ask us questions and I can relay them to you. But Tommy, who's directing us, is showing the very fine detail of the stem of the glasses.
Well, splendid. Well, you can see the stem. It's a little owl. And the name of it, every Lalique item has a title, a name. It's called rapace, which is the name for that particular small owl in French. And what's unique, of course, is the combination of this violet color and clear glass. That Lalique didn't do that in anything else. It's complicated to make. But when I say these are rare, there is a catalogue raisonné of Lalique that was published initially over a decade ago. One model of this, the champagne glass, which we also have, was never seen before. It had never appeared. We found them. When I say we, a heritage client found a little group of these glasses classic story, a thrift shop somewhere in the Northeast. Brought them to me, said, I think I'd like to sell these glasses. What can we do? And she had no idea what the value was. We've sold a number of them. On October 28th, we'll sell the balance of her treasure trove find. And I think we've already sold close to $15,000 or $20,000 worth of these glasses. They are extraordinary. The most I think we sold one for was about $1,800 or $2,000 really? For an individual glass. So enjoy the water.
It is the best water I've ever had. Meanwhile, there's a cup sitting off camera that nobody can see that I'm gonna, every time we cut to an image, I'm gonna actually drink from that and just leave this one here. Because if you know anything about me during my time at Heritage, I came here to work, to be around this sort of hands-on museum. And yet I've discovered that over time, I don't like touching anything because I find it all to be so valuable, fragile, and important that why should I be the guy that history sees as the one who messed that one thing up that survived for this amount of time? I just don't want to be, I'm the butterfly effect in the flesh. So I have a million questions for you, and we're going to discuss the state of the art market when it comes to Lalique and Art Glass. And if you have a question for Nick, pop it up here on the screen or email tommyn@ha.com if you don't want to reveal your full name. We'll get it to Nick one way or the other. But I have to ask you, you've been doing this for 40 years, 42 years to be specific. What drew you to Lalique and to Art Glass?
Well, that's a good question. I arrived in New York 42 years ago, 1979, and got married. My wife is from New Jersey, and we've been there ever since. Even before that, I was in the business. I grew up in the business to some extent. My mother was an antiques dealer in England. So in the late 60s, I was buying and selling things. Not Lalique, although I did see a piece of Lalique in the late 60s that my family had bought. We put it in the antique shop, and I think after a year it sold, and we made about £1 on it, you know? Today it would be worth a couple of $1,000s, but in those days it was £3 or £4. But fast forward to working in New York, I started my career there in 1979 at a small auction house, and very soon moved to a much larger one, Phillips. But at the small auctioneer was when I first saw Lalique. We handled an estate in Manhattan, which had some fabulous Art Deco in it. And in those days, you know, the estates typically were property that had been bought in the 20s and 30s. You know, today, if you handle an estate with the generational cycle, it's often property from the 60s or 50s. But we were lucky. I was seeing a lot of great early Art Deco things, and among them Lalique. Got to see it, and Tiffany for the first time. I'd never seen Tiffany before. But then I moved to Phillips shortly after that, 1980, and Phillips was running auctions of just Lalique. So I got thrown in the deep end and really got to understand it. There wasn't much literature on it, so I had to do a good deal of my own research. But and there was a relatively small group of people who were involved in it, dealing in it, collecting it, buying and selling it. And we were the only auctioneer. So I got really to understand Lalique in the early 80s by handling a tremendous amount of it, to the point that I decided to write a book on it, which I started writing in 85 and published it in 86. So.
Well, what did you, as you began to be around Lalique more and more often, to the point of researching and writing about it, because I'm always envious of those who find the thing that they're passionate about and can find the time, passion, and attention, and sort of to stick with it long enough for decades. So what is it that drew you to it? Was it the story of Lalique? Was it the work produced by the factory? Was it, I mean, what really sort of made you engage with this for the long haul? Because you are the world's expert on the subject. And I am fascinated by those who know more about a thing than anybody else.
Well, thank you. And I've thought about this question too. And I think I have all the answers. I'm going to start by telling you that Lalique was a genius. René Lalique was a genius. He was, to a certain extent, in the right place at the right time. He was born in 1860, died in 1945. So his life and career spans the entire history of what you might call the modern movement. And he's on the front line of that. So he's exposed to all these progressive ideas, and he takes them and he runs with them. We know his name mostly in the world of glass. But a lot of people don't realize that René Lalique did not start designing manufacturing glass commercially until he was about 50. And when you think of the enormous legacy of glass designs that he's left us, I've always thought that's very encouraging, especially if you're around 50, you know?
When you said that just now, I got all excited. The potential that lies ahead.
But let me use this little object to demonstrate my main answer to your question. This is a little clock, what the French call a pendulette, a little clock. And it's one of a whole group of clocks that René Lalique designed, mostly to appeal to women in the post-World War I period, its early 20s. And he was thinking, what can I make to sell to make a profit? You know, he wasn't thinking, how can I be the best and most exquisite glass designer in the world? He was a commercial glassmaker. But look at what he's done on this clock. Swallows, hirondelle, which is the name of it, are one of his favorite subjects. Before he was 50, he was the leading jeweler in the world, and swallows appear a lot in his jewelry. But here he's taken these swallows, kind of captured in a millisecond of time as they flock in the sky, something he did in jewelry, and he's just put them on the front of this clock. And when you think about it, if anyone else designed a clock, what would they do? They'd leave the face of the clock clear so you could read it. René Lalique has put the face of the clock behind the swallows. Now this is extreme progressive design. He has thought way beyond anyone else of his time, or arguably, in my opinion, before, since his time, in terms of how can I design an object. I spent a good deal of time looking at the history of design. I taught history of design for many years at university. I've never come across anyone who was as talented, as progressive a designer as René Lalique, or as capable. And when you consider that he could design anything from a tiny and exquisite piece of jewelry to a building, which he designed several of, and everything in between, and literally thousands of pieces of glass, each one as beautiful as the next, nobody comes close. And if you compare some of the things he did to people who were copying him at the time, for instance, no one comes anywhere near it. So to me, I love quality in everything. I like quality in my water glass, and I like quality in food and drink and life in general. The quality of Lalique to me is the best you'll ever find. Having an object close to you, and by the way, I urge you to do what you said you're not going to do. I urge you to have a few of these things and maybe buy them and keep them at home, you know, but they will enrich your life, just the sheer quality of the design.
But as you're learning about Lalique, as you're learning about the art behind the end product, what surprised you the most? What kept you coming back to it again and again and again? Because the fact that you remember seeing Lalique in the 60s before this became, you know, a career in selling it and writing about and being a scholar in this particular field, what was it that initially attracted you to it, and what surprised you the most? Because every artist that I've ever loved keeps revealing something to me about themselves, whether it's through their art, through their writings, or through others talking about them.
That's a great question. And when I started with Lalique in earnest in the early 80s, I would see lots of it because it would be given to me for auction, and I would meet collectors and so on, hundreds of different designs. I think what got me was when I realized just how much of it there was. And I didn't really discover that until the catalogue raisonnés started to be printed some years later. And there was this vast record, some of which I had discovered when I wrote the book, because I had access to much of the records that the catalogue raisonné used. So I started seeing these things just in an old black and white photograph from 1929 and thinking, wow, you know, why wonder if that still exists, or where is that? So in many respects, my career and what has been the kind of inspiration for my career is finding these things, just being able to track them down, look for them. And I'm still doing that. I'm still amazed at the variety, the spectrum of design that René Lalique was able to come up with. I'm still, like the rapace, I'm still finding things that I have never seen before in 40 odd years of dealing with more of it than anyone else on the planet, I expect. So it's that opportunity to find more stuff and just handle it and see it and learn about it. I've also, in recent years, I think 6-7 years ago, there was a book published by the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, which was René Lalique's correspondence with primarily his girlfriend at the time in the 1890s, and when he was at the peak of his jewelry career. And I read through this book. It's a fabulous book. When he's writing to all these people, they have the correspondence in the museum, and the book, the letters that he receives and the letters that he writes. And some of them are to quite famous people, Auguste Rodin, people that he knew in Paris. But it's a window into his mind and how he was thinking, and for that matter, what he was doing, including ordinary things. And I think in recent years, that's what has been revealed about René Lalique, more about his inner self. A museum of Lalique opened in Paris, opened in Alsace, about 10 years ago. And that has explored Lalique, the person, much more than anyone else, any other place before. So I've learned a great deal more about him personally lately, and that's been stimulating, and it's enough to keep me going, you know.
Does the opening of a museum dedicated to his work change the value of and or interest in Lalique's work? Because suddenly, well, these are museum-worthy pieces. These don't just become things to display, things to use. These are now things that are clearly coveted by those who would enshrine them in a museum.
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, the opening of a museum does have an effect, but not necessarily what you might think.
How so?
If something is in a museum, if it's given to a museum, it's off the market. And the chances are it's off the market forever and ever, amen. And what gives something monetary value? Well, there are two things: supply and demand. If we're going to talk about value and what gives something value, we might as well end the conversation there, because that's it. But what happens when Lalique is given to a museum, and in the last 3 years, there have been 2 enormous donations of private collections of Lalique to museums, both in the United States. And there has been a consistent flow of property given to or lent to the Lalique Museum in France. This takes many of the items off the market, some of which are unique, and it actually makes it much more difficult in a way to collect the work of René Lalique, because the supply is significantly diminished. Yes, indeed, the museum gives the opportunity for anyone and everyone to come and see it, either in person or on the website and so on. It promotes the work. And I'm confident that that does inspire some people to say, I think I'd like to buy a piece of that. But at the same time, I believe that the opposite effect is much more telling and dramatic, that, you know, if you extend this whole thing to its ultimate degree, all of it will be in museums. So no one can collect it anymore. And that's something that I'm a little bit afraid of.
Well, tell me, who has the collector for Lalique changed in your time doing this? As people knew more, thanks in large part to your work, about Lalique's work, has the collector, and with the opening of a museum, and certainly the gravitas given the work over the last 40 years, has the collector significantly changed? Do you find that people are coming to you that you never would have imagined might have collected this 10, 15, 20 years ago? And what has that done over the last few years in terms of the value itself, and certainly what we have realized?
Yes, there have been changes in the demographic, if you like, of the collector over the years. But I think it's put that in perspective. If you talk about other realms of glass, let's say you're talking about the work of Émile Gallet or even Louis Comfort Tiffany or Dome or something like that, typically, if you're a collector of those things, you collect that. You collect Gallet.
Mm-hmm.
People who collect Lalique are typically much more specialized because you see, Lalique had thousands of different types of object that were presented, some of which were made in fairly small groups and series, others of which were made in large numbers. So if you're going to be a Lalique collector, and all of these people exist, there are people who just collect stemware.
Right.
There are people who just collect clocks. There are people who just collect perfume bottles. There are people who just collect boxes. There are people who just collect colored vases. There are people who just collect automobile mascots. So there is a wide range, and the people who collect mascots wouldn't necessarily buy a vase, you know. There are people who collect Lalique, and they collect the whole thing, and they try and do it comprehensively too. So there are different stripes of collectors. I've found over the decades, there are probably more collectors of certain categories of Lalique than other. For instance, vases, colored vases. A lot of people like them.
Really?
And you don't necessarily have to be a Lalique collector. If you're an Art Deco fan, a Lalique vase is the perfect complement.
We're seeing one now. Folks are looking one now on their screens.
Very well. Well, a great Lalique vase is we're looking at a classic Lalique vase called Serpent. We have a great one coming up looking just like this on October 28th. And here's a great example of what he can do. You know, it's a vase. It's a coiled serpent. He makes the vase in the form of the object. Now, this is actually, again, very advanced design, which very few people were really able to pull off. But this object, yeah, if you're a Lalique collector, you'd like one. If you're Ruhlmann furniture, this looks incredible on it. So there's a lot of market for this. It's a dramatic thing.
Are there pieces that you know are out there that you have not yet seen, that you know that you covet? I mean, certainly one reason we do these conversations is to discuss the state of the market, what is selling well. We also do these to discuss the fact that you do have an auction upcoming in October for which you're accepting consignments. I assume that there are pieces out there that you know to exist and haven't seen, and just, you know, I sort of imagine you're a bit of the Indiana Jones of the Lalique world in terms of that which you have uncovered, discovered, and recovered over the last 40 years.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment.
You are a dashing son of a gun, I'll say that.
It takes one to know one, Robert.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I've always been intrigued by. And Indiana Jones could probably find this, but I don't know whether I ever will. In the 1930s, I think it was the early 30s, in Paris, they installed I think there were 3 or could have been 4 Lalique fountains on what are called the ronde-point of the Champs-Élysées. The Champs-Élysées is interrupted at some point, a kind of crossroads. And in the corners, they put these Lalique fountains. Okay, there are great photographs of them. And they're magnificent things. They have animals on them, squirrels and pigeons and stuff. And when you see a Lalique fountain, anyway, it's a spectacular thing. There aren't many of them around intact, but there's a few. It's a great one outside the Savoy Hotel in London. But these must have been an absolute showstopper. Anyway, they were removed by the good people of Paris during World War II and the occupation. And according to everything I've heard, nobody knows where they are. If anyone out watching knows where they are, I would be delighted to know that. But that's the kind of lost treasure, one of them anyway. Having said that, Lalique jewelry is something I love discovering.
Really?
And occasionally you'll find a piece, you know, you'll be in an estate. And it happens once in a blue moon. And occasionally, there it is. You open the thing and there it is. You know, that's always a heart stopper. But yeah, I love finding in the realm of old cars. When you talk about a barn find, I think you know what that is. And we dream of barn finds in Lalique. You know, we love to find something with anything actually, but especially Lalique. And Lalique is young enough that this can happen. You like to find it in situ. You like to find it in its original place.
Right.
You know, you walk into a house, and I've done this in Los Angeles, and there's a light fixture that's been hanging there since 1931. Or someone brings it to you. My mother bought this in 1929, and there it is. So to find it in its original ownership, that whatever it is, frankly, that's something I look forward to.
Tell me about what else is sitting on the table with us. We talked about automobile hood ornaments.
Sure.
My father, as someone who rebuilt Model A Fords when he was a kid and ran an auto parts store, certainly hood ornaments I was around my entire life. Was obsessed with them, enamored of them, delighted to see them. Whenever I see them, I know exactly what they are. I know exactly where they came from, but this is a stunning piece.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm a big fan of them. René Lalique.
Should pull that out a little bit?
Sure,
so
let me do that.
I'm not touching.
That's fine. You've made your position clear.
Crystal, as it were.
René Lalique designed a series of 30 glass, what the French called radiator stoppers, bouchon de radiateur, and we call them car mascots or automobile mascots, motoring mascots, they call them in England. By the way, there is a difference between a mascot and a hood ornament.
Right.
A mascot is an object, it's usually a little piece of statuary that sits on the very front of the car, typically the prominent radiator cap. After the sort of mid-30s, the automobile design changes. You get, you know, sleeker bonnets, you get fronts of cars. And in America in particular, the hood ornament, which is sort of a long aerodynamic thing, takes over. But from about the early years of the First World War up until the early 30s, car mascots were a popular thing. I wrote a book about them, and I compare them to a gentleman's tie, which I'm happy neither of us are wearing today, but it's the only part of the whole thing that has no function. You know what I mean? And like a tie, it's up front and prominent, and you can change it according to your mood. And you can have one that represents a particular brand, you know, or you can just have one that's fun. But these things that, I mean, again, talk about the genius of this guy. Yes, there were mascots, but of course they're all metal, you know, like the famous ones that we know. Rolls-Royce, Bentley, they, you know, BMW, they all had one. All the French models. Lalique comes along, says, this is in 1925, let's make them in glass. And let's not just make them in glass, let's illuminate them. So you've got this thing that you can bolt onto the front of the car, and you can light it up from underneath with a colored filter, so you can have different colors. And you could run them on a magneto system so that the faster you go, the greater intensity of light is thrown into this thing. So imagine, you know, tazzing through the French countryside in 1925 with this thing lit up, leading the way. But I brought this one along. It's not a René Lalique car mascot. It was designed in the 1990s, in about 1990, 91, I think, by Lalique for Rolls-Royce, of course. We all recognize this. It's the most famous of all mascots, the Spirit of Ecstasy, as she's officially called, designed originally by a British sculptor called Charles Sykes in 1911. But René Lalique and Rolls-Royce, two good names, co-branded and made this thing in a limited edition, very limited edition. I don't think, and the world doesn't think, they made perhaps more than 50 of them, although they said they were making 200. But early in the production, it was understood, as I believe it, that they wouldn't pass any kind of regulation in motoring, so it couldn't be used in any way. And I think they just stopped making them. So they're very, very thin on the ground, these things. And if you collect mascots, you kind of have to have this. It's a bit like And let's talk a little about value, because as you know, you're a comic guy, a sports card guy. What gives a sports card value? Supply and demand. The rare ones is what you want.
The one of ones.
The one of one. So of course it has to be in great condition, but assuming that, it's condition and rarity. With Lalique, rarity is what it's all about, but it's not just that. The reason that some baseball cards, coins, comics get such attention is because you've got to collect the set. And the collecting the set concept, I give a lot of credit, frankly, to Heritage for that, for developing that in combination with grading, which allows you to not only know the level of your individual piece, and by extension the level of your set in terms of its grading, but also the population of that set. This is a huge thing in terms of developing the market for something. In Lalique, there are parallels, and the closest is in the realm of collecting mascots, because there is a definable set. You know, there is a definable set of clocks too, but there's a lot of them, and collecting all of them, very few people are competing with that. But people are competing to collect the mascots. If you've got all of the René Lalique mascots, which represents an investment of perhaps $1 million, you kind of need this one. It's icing on the cake.
What is the estimate on that?
I think it's 5,000 to 7,000. It's either that or 4 to 6. But it's an estimate designed to be attractive. We've sold, I think, one before like this, and it sold for over 10. So it's just, to me, René Lalique didn't design it. Lalique didn't design it. Charles Sykes designed it. But Lalique made it, and I think it's just a fabulous thing. And people who like and collect Rolls Royces can afford this, you know? So I hope this will do well. I hope it'll take off.
So what has Lalique done, the interest in and the value of, over the last year and a half? Because I'm fascinated by what we've experienced over the last year and a half. I never would have imagined when I came here in March of 2020, as the world was beginning to change quite abruptly, that in fact we would see such significant upticks in so many categories. And we ascribe any number of reasons to that, whether it's nostalgia, whether it's alternative investments, or simply realizing that I want to own a thing. Now is the time to finally own that thing I have always wanted to own. People weren't taking trips, they were investing in certain categories that they may never have thought about before. So I wonder what the last year has done, and if in fact that there has been a retreat to, or an attraction to Lalique for the very reasons that we've seen those kind of upticks in other categories.
I think all of the reasons you just identify are extremely accurate and very important to understand. And I'll go one step further. The goal of every auctioneer is to get as many bids as possible. And you get as many bids as possible, beginning as many people to look at something as possible. And that has happened over the last year and a half. For all the reasons you say, I think alternative investment is an important one. There's nothing vulgar about thinking in those terms, as some people believe there is. I think wanting to have something that you've not had before is definitely an important consideration. And what's happened with the exposure to auction, and we're very good at this, your department is very good at publicizing what we do. So many more people are now latching on, literally logging on to Heritage Auctions, ha.com, or finding it through somewhere. And more importantly, feeling comfortable bidding. You know, there was a time, certainly in much of my career, the concept of bidding at auction was a rarefied air. It was most people wouldn't even think about doing
popular
it.
Culture certainly has given people the impression that it's people in tuxedos drinking champagne in stuffy rooms full of paddles, a world with which you were probably very well familiar once upon a time.
Yes, and that was almost entirely untrue. But what's happened is auctions have become accessible to a huge range of the population. You can compare it to the way the stock market works. You know, the stock market used to be a few, those guys in the bow ties, and now it's everybody. But with respect to Lalique, I think it's more the question of wanting to own something beautiful, exquisite, that perhaps you'd never felt you had the opportunity to own before. Lalique is to some extent aspirational, but we show that Lalique is accessible to so many people. A lot of the Lalique we offer, you know, is estimated under $500.
There's some, I believe, in an auction today.
Yes, there is some in what we call our showcase auctions, our monthly auctions.
Perfume bottles and things that are
Yes.
far more affordable than a Rolls Royce.
Very much so. And by the way, the Lalique company has always kind of done that too. The Lalique company has always made things, which still exists, and it's actually, in some ways, an important part of the market for Lalique. But they've always made things available at a reasonable price. Yes, it is a luxury brand, but it's not an exclusive luxury brand.
But I assume that that was intentional in as much as that it wanted to show that the best was still attainable by those who did not make Rolls Royce money.
I think that's fair to say. And, you know, part of the ethic in René Lalique's time, and particularly in the 20s, was that you can and should improve the quality of your life by improving the quality of design around you. You know, if you're going to have a glass at home, which we all do, why not have a great one? Why not have a beautifully designed one? This is modernism, sort of the Bauhaus ethic, which René Lalique subscribed to. To go back to your question, what's happened is the market has, I wouldn't say it's gone up dramatically, but I would say the demand has definitely expanded. And by extension, some of the prices have gone up, some of the results have gone up, and we're very happy to see that. We do have, in fairly recent years, we have a luxury department at Heritage, which has cast the net way beyond the typical bidders here, you know, largely towards women, for instance. And that's, I think, opened a new audience for us. And Lalique is a French luxury brand that if you collect Hermes and Chanel, you can identify with very quickly.
Here's a question from Vivian. Curious to know how many perfume bottles Lalique designed for Coty and Blanc perfumes and how they were doing on the market.
Sure.
I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes. Well, René Lalique really started his glass-making career through an association with François Coty, who he met in 1906 or 7 in Paris. They were neighbors on Place Vendôme. So he started designing and making perfumes for Coty about 1907, 1908. And by the time their relationship ended, which it did during the First World War, I think I'm right in saying, and it's in the catalogue raisonné, so I don't know exactly, and I may be wrong here, but I think it's about 20 designs that René Lalique created for François Coty, all in the first, between about 1908 and about 1918. After that, Coty, who had this enormous empire, made hundreds of thousands of perfume bottles in his own factories, many of which were René Lalique designs that he just kept making, but they weren't made by Lalique. So the typical Coty bottle that you see was made by Coty, possibly designed by Lalique, but not made by him. The early Coty bottles are pretty fabulous, but Lalique had other perfume patrons at the time. All the other perfume companies in France started using Lalique to design their products. And some of those are much sort of richer and more exquisite. Coty was more of a mass producer. But in terms of the value of them, you can buy a really nice plain René Lalique for Coty perfume bottle from 1912, 13, 14 for under $500. If you want a really good one with decoration on it and so on, you might be paying $5,000, but somewhere in between those two.
We're looking at a bottle now.
We're looking at a rather simple Coty Coty bottle of early design. I'm not entirely sure what we're learning about that one, but it's you say, yeah, that's typical of René Lalique's early designs, I think, for Coty.
Mhm.
And he designed not just the glass, but also the label. The labels were actually what he designed first, yeah. And the box that it came in and everything else, the whole package was designed by René Lalique. A lot of the success of this stuff has to do with the First World War, between 1914 and 18. There were millions of soldiers who came through France, mostly British and Allied, and of course Americans. And what did they want to take back if they were lucky enough to get home to their wives and sweethearts? They took a little bottle of French perfume, and this is a tradition that continues. Militaries still do that, and this just kick-started the perfume business throughout, particularly Coty's empire.
Josh asks, I've always wondered how antique glass impacts the prices of modern glass art, such as Mackay. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what that question is.
Here you go. My eyesight is failing me miserably of late, so I'll...
What was on it? Such as Mackay in Maui. I think he's referring to what we call a studio glass maker. And there is a big difference in the demand for antique glass, by the way, is a big word, Josh. I have a book in my library called Glass of 5,000 Year History. We've been making glass for a very long time.
How thick is that book?
It's pretty thick. And, so what Lalique's been making glass for 100 years or so, and it's all modern. Studio glass, which is a relatively recent movement, certainly post-war, and most of what we see in studio glass was made in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. It's a very different market. We sell that in our design auctions. It's mostly unique. And what the primary difference between René Lalique and the Lalique company and all the other glass makers in the world ever, including studio glass makers, is that he made glass in a factory. He learned from, to a certain extent, his contemporaries who made glass in the old-fashioned way, Émile Gallet being the best example, who had huge admiration for René Lalique. But Gallet was making glass in the way that the Romans made it, 2,000 years earlier, in a modern technique, but in a modern approach, but in the same technique. Lalique said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to, blow glass or thing. I'm not going to make it in an artisanal manner. I'm going to make it in a factory. It's a very modern approach.
Using molds, correct?
Molds, it's mass produced. It's made by, I've been in the factory many times. It hasn't changed much, frankly, today from the way they did it when the factory opened in 1921. So it's made by pulling levers, forcing hot air into a metal mold and blowing it. And there's very little handwork. And that's the key of Lalique to me. That's why he is so modern and so distinct from anyone else. And it's actually why a lot of people who would collect other makers, like modern studio makers or like Émile Gallet before him, they wouldn't collect Lalique. It's a different ethic.
Brenda asks, what is the single most valuable piece of Lalique?
It would be a piece of jewelry. It would be, his jewelry is mostly unique, incredible. I don't know the highest price I ever paid at auction for a piece of jewelry, but it would be over $1 million, I'm sure.
Have we ever offered any?
Very few pieces.
Really?
Yeah, very few.
Because they are so exceptionally rare?
It comes on the market very rarely, but it would be a piece of jewelry. In terms of glass, a good 30 years ago, a Lalique fountain, which had been discovered in a garden somewhere in the south of France, sold at auction for close to $1 million. And that's the highest by quite a long way, actually, that I've seen.
So I've discovered there are two things that you're looking for now: Lalique jewelry and the fountain, the missing fountain.
The missing fountains and jewelry. And also, the one great, in the catalogue raisonné, as I said, Lalique made everything in a factory. But if you go to the end of the catalogue, there's this list of what are called cire perdu glass pieces. Now, cire perdu means lost wax in France. And René Lalique developed this technique, an ancient technique, where you make something by starting with a wax master, that you carve this wax thing, and then you make that through a series of casting into an object. You can make a solid object or a hollow object that way. If anything drives my passion, it would be trying to find more of these. There are a few hundred of them known. They're all unique, and most of them we know where they are. They're in a museum somewhere, or they're in this private collection, or they've been lost. We sometimes know that. The most valuable glass is in the cire perdu world. There have been several pieces sold over $500,000 in the past, and that's a lot. And I suspect there are pieces out there that would be still worth more than that, and perhaps quite a bit more than that. But that's the most valuable glass. And we've sold a few pieces of that, but not quite to that level.
Is it possible for you, Vivian asked, to speak to Lalique Prat de Verre jewelry designs from the late 19th century?
Sure. Well, Lalique, as I say, started his career as a jeweler. In the 1890s, he made jewelry which was mostly unique pieces. He would draw it, and then he would have it made in his studio. Some pieces were made in series. He did use glass at that point. He used small elements of glass that he would cast. And he did sometimes use pâte de verre. Pâte de verre is a glass paste in French, and it's an ancient technique that was kind of rediscovered from the ancient world by the French in the 1870s and 80s. And it was suitable for making tiny pieces of glass, sort of a jewelry element from. Other glass makers made larger pieces. But I write in my book that I think he learned some of the secrets of the ancient glass makers, including pâte de verre, from a guy called Henri Cros, and possibly from other contemporaries. But there's very, very few pieces of Lalique jewelry with pâte de verre. There's a famous one in the Corning Museum of Glass. Beyond that, very few. If you're going to use pâte de verre, you might as well use enamel, which is something Lalique was immensely talented at using. And he would use colored enamels, far more than anything else, including glass elements. So you see very little pâte de verre, and I hope that answers your question.
First of all, I've used my high school French very seldom in the last 30 some odd years. So I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to mangle French as often as I possibly can here. So I appreciate that, Vivian. Have we seen, excuse me, has there been a corresponding uptick in interest in and value of other art glass with the rise in interest in Lalique?
Yes, there has, and not really because of the.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean that that one has to do with the other.
Yes, well, if we look back a little at heritage auctions, and I give us some credit for this. 12 years ago, when I joined the company, we didn't have a department selling art glass. We sold art glass in sales of general furniture and works of art, decorative arts. We kind of developed that category, and we've built it up over the years. And other auctioneers have followed suit to some extent. We weren't the first. It was done before at other places, but we were the first, I think, to do it in this particular level and to keep it going. And so today we have what I believe is the largest, and of course I believe is the best auction of Lalique and Art Glass that you'll find anywhere in the world. We do it twice a year, spring and fall. But that sale, and you'll see it on October 28th, it's beginning to populate now at ha.com. And in the next 3 to 4 weeks, it'll start looking pretty good. I'm here in Dallas. I've been able to look at most of the property that's in the auction, and I'm really impressed. Every time we do an auction, we seem to get better and better things. And in response, our clients are becoming more and more loyal and dedicated. They look forward to these auctions. Their demands, to a certain extent, drive what we bring in. And yes, we've seen unquestionably an uptick in demand for this. One of the beautiful things about Heritage is how many registered bidders we have. At last count, I think it was 1.2 million.
1.5.
Oh, wow. It went up a lot.
In the last year, it has gone up 250,000.
Wow. Well, as I said earlier, there's auctioneers have one goal, which is to get as many bids as possible. It's that simple. But what we found is we'll throw out pictures of our art glass, which are undeniably beautiful. And a lot of the clients will see that, and they'll go, oh, that's nice. I think I'll buy, even though they may be a sports card collector or a coin collector or something else. We run an ad for this auction in Coin World. I don't know if you know that. Mm-hmm. And if you know the magazine Coin World, with no disrespect to my coin colleagues and collectors, it's page after page of coins. And you're looking at it and it's writing about coins and pictures of coins. And then you come to like page 7 and there's a Tiffany lamp in full color, And you go coins and coins. And it gets your attention.
It pops.
It pops. So we are finding what in your department we love to call crossover bidding, mm-hmm. right?
There is a significant amount of crossover that has taken place in the last year that, as I understand it, Heritage had not previously seen. Yes, and I believe if you're going to boil down what we're talking about here to why is it happening, crossover bidding is what it's all about. And Heritage just has that because of the categories that we offer, you see. We are by far the most widespread in our offerings than any auctioneer in the world. More so than many of them put together. More than 45 categories, I think, at this point.
Right. I lost count. I was up to 42. So you're way ahead of me. It's impressive, but we are the supply. The demand keeps growing. So speaking of demand, somebody asked the question that I was actually just about to get to. What is the current demand for Tiffany lamps? That's a good question. Tiffany lamps, somewhat like Lalique glass, do get sucked into museums. Mm-hmm. And there were only so many of them. They were not mass produced in the same way that Lalique was. They were not widely exported. You never see a Tiffany lamp in Europe unless someone's bought it in the States and brought it over there. They didn't market them. Even in the day, they weren't widely marketed throughout North America. So in New York, where I live, we see more Tiffany lamps than anywhere else in the world because many of them kind of never left. They are hard to find. And what's hard to find is a really good one, good, authentic, good condition. I believe the market for Tiffany lamps is in its infancy.
Really?
Even though it's been around for a good half a century, I think it still has massive potential. Why? Because it's one of the most beautiful things in the world you'll ever see. It's practical. If you have one in your, I own 2 Tiffany lamps, and they are, one of them has pride of place in my living room. I bought it in 1980. And it's brought so much joy to my family, and it's been a great investment, but it's just been a part of my family, And if you buy a Tiffany lamp, you buy it, I think, for that reason. I think a lot of people don't understand what a Tiffany lamp is because it's become a generic term.
Right. I have a beautiful knockoff in my home.
I'm so do many people. And, you go into a diner and the waitress says, sit under the Tiffany lamp, but it's not a Tiffany lamp.
Right. It's a Coca-Cola.
It's Coca-Cola.
Right.
And so it's become a kind of generic term. But if you cut through all that and say, you know, a real authentic Tiffany lamp, there's not that many of them. And finding one is not easy. I think if you buy one, you can and should buy it for a long time. Same way you buy a piano,
right.
you know. But it can bring enormous enjoyment to your family. It can enrich you. And it, like collecting things in general, collecting Lalique's a good example. It can take you to different places, you know. If you own a Tiffany lamp, you'll become part of a relatively small community of people who do. And meeting and discoursing with those people is rewarding. Lalique takes you to all kinds of places, starting with Paris, you know. If you go to Paris as a Lalique collector, it'll give you a whole different perspective on a visit to Paris. You can go, as I have many times, to Père Lachaise cemetery and visit his grave. But I think Tiffany lamps have got so much further to go. And Tiffany in general, you know, Tiffany made a lot of other stuff beyond lamps. Great Tiffany vases, beautiful things. I think they've got a lot further to go than they are now.
We have been here for about an hour. So first of all, it felt like 5 minutes.
Didn't it?
You are an American and an English treasure. So thanks for doing this. This has been a delight. We have consignments still available for the October 28th auction.
2 weeks.
2 weeks to go. Best way to get a hold of you if folks have something they'd like to consign, or if they know where some of these mysterious objects that you are seeking might be residing at the moment. What's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Well, the simplest thing is to go to ha.com and look at Lalique and Art Glass. It's one of our categories. You'll see me in there. You can search me there. Nick D, Nickd at ha.com will get me directly. I'm in the New York office, but I move around a lot. Here I am in Dallas. I was in Chicago yesterday. Always ready to answer your calls and inquiries about Art Glass or anything else.
Do you have any antique roadshow appearances upcoming?
Yes, I'm taping in 2 weeks' time somewhere in Connecticut, taping in Colonial Williamsburg right after that. Those tapings will show next year. But I think I'm right in saying I taped last year, and I think I'm right in saying that I'll be on the show next week somewhere.
Next week?
Somewhere.
It is always a pleasure to be in the presence of a television star. I can't thank you enough for doing this, and I thank everybody who's watched and asked questions. Obviously, you can rewatch this on YouTube to your heart's content. We'll do this again whenever we can pin you down, but I can't thank you enough. A thorough education and an absolute delight.
My pleasure, Robert. Thank you very much.
You bet.